Roddy McDowall was Hollywood's most trusted friend, but behind his lens lay a secret collection of photos, so raw and intimate that the big studios fought for decades to keep them buried. While the world saw the glamour, McDowall's camera captured the breaking points of icons like Elizabeth Taylor and Judy Garland, moments they thought were private, until now. We have all seen the glossy, heavily retouched studio portraits of the 1960s. The pristine smiles, the perfectly coiffed hair, the untouchable aura of demigods living in the Hollywood hills. That was the illusion. A billion-dollar mirage engineered by men in tailored suits to sell movie tickets and keep the masses dreaming in the dark. But the reality behind those iron gates was a suffocating pressure cooker, an environment designed to manufacture perfection at the absolute expense of sanity. To understand the sheer explosive power of Roddy McDowall's photography, you have to truly understand the era he was operating in. The classic Hollywood studio system was essentially a beautifully decorated prison. Every major star was bound by ironclad morality clauses. Publicity departments acted like heavily militarized intelligence agencies, relentlessly controlling every narrative, every leak, and every single public appearance. If a star had a nervous breakdown, an addiction spiral, or a messy breakup, a studio fixer was dispatched in the middle of the night to bribe the police, silence the witnesses, and bury the story permanently. The paparazzi existed back then, of course, but they were vicious outsiders. They violently clawed at the iron gates, flashing harsh, blinding bulbs in the faces of terrified celebrities as they stumbled out of nightclubs or sprinted through airports. The stars knew to keep their heavy armor on at all times in public, but Roddy McDowall was different. He was the ultimate Trojan horse, because he had been a highly successful child star himself, debuting in profound cinematic classics like How Green Was My Valley. He was literally born into the machine. He grew up in the exact same gilded cage as the people he was photographing. To the biggest, most untrusting stars on the planet, Roddy was not the predatory press. He was not a scheming publicist. He was family. He was an insider who casually carried a Leica camera around his neck like a permanent appendage. After a while, the camera just became an invisible extension of Roddy. And because it was just their dear friend Roddy sitting in the corner of the room, the stars made the ultimate mistake, or perhaps they made the ultimate confession. They stopped posing. They finally took off the masks. Take Elizabeth Taylor as the prime example. She and Roddy met as young teenagers on the set of Lassie Come Home. Over the years, they forged an unbreakable bond that would somehow survive multiple marriages, tragic near-death experiences, and the ruthless, daily meat grinder of the global press. By the early 1960s, Elizabeth Taylor was arguably the most famous, heavily scrutinized, and scandal-plagued woman on the face of the earth. Production of the historical epic Cleopatra was an absolute financial hemorrhage for the studio, and her deeply publicized affair with Richard Burton had actually drawn massive public condemnation from the Vatican itself. The paparazzi were hunting her across the streets of Rome like a pack of starving wolves. If she even stepped onto a hotel balcony, 100 massive telephoto lenses fired off in the distance. But who was actually inside the private villa with her? Roddy McDowall. He was granted unprecedented, total, uncensored access. But the images he captured behind closed doors were completely antithetical to the scandalous headlines splashed across every tabloid. He did not photograph a home-wrecking siren or a highly demanding, diamond-draped diva. He photographed a deeply exhausted, intensely vulnerable human being. His lens caught the quiet, devastating moments in the dressing room when the world's most beautiful woman was staring blankly into the mirror, crushed by the absolute weight of her own manufactured mythology. He captured the dark circles under her eyes, the genuine anxiety gripping her posture, the rare moments of unguarded laughter that lacked any of her usual calculated, defensive poise. The studio executives desperately wanted to project an image of imperial invincibility for the star of Cleopatra to save their sinking investment. Roddy's intimate photos, however, revealed the massive structural cracks in the foundation. They showed a woman who was hanging on by a rapidly fraying thread. He captured the quiet, lonely mornings, the unbrushed hair, the profound isolation that comes when you are surrounded by an entourage of 50 people, but have absolutely no one in the room you can genuinely trust. But right here is where the story takes a deeply sinister, almost unbelievable turn. You might be assuming that Roddy McDowall was simply a loyal, artistic friend documenting cinematic history for posterity. But there is a massive, incredibly dark paradox hidden inside the legacy of these archives. What you need to understand is that the studio bosses were absolutely terrified of what Roddy was doing. Why? Because in the 1960s, authenticity was considered a lethal, existential threat to the bottom line. The very photographs we now look at as brilliant masterpieces of human vulnerability were viewed by the Hollywood machine as extremely dangerous liabilities. What happened to a massive portion of his private archive, the sheer volume of photographic negatives that mysteriously vanished from his collections or were allegedly suppressed by powerful industry entities who feared their release, will completely shatter how you view Hollywood history. Before we uncover the devastating truth about those missing negatives and the whispered blackmail rumors that haunted the industry, we have to look closely at the star who desperately needed Roddy's empathetic lens the most. That star was the legendary Judy Garland. If Elizabeth Taylor was the ultimate survivor of the brutal studio system, Judy Garland was without question its most tragic casualty. For decades, the paying public had been spoon-fed the heartwarming narrative of the plucky, wide-eyed, innocent girl from the Midwest. But behind heavily locked doors, the studio executives had kept her running on a lethal, mandated cocktail of amphetamines to keep her awake for grueling 18-hour shoots, followed by heavy barbiturates to knock her unconscious at night. By the time the 1960s rolled around, the public perception of Judy was rapidly, cruelly shifting. The press eagerly documented her concert cancellations, her dramatic weight fluctuations, and her increasingly erratic behavior. The public wanted a sensational freak show, but when Roddy McDowall pointed his lens at Judy, he performed an act of profound, radical empathy. He did not shoot her from low, unflattering angles to sell a cheap tabloid cover. He photographed her in moments of terrifying, absolute stillness. His images of Judy capture a fragile, brilliant, broken artist who is entirely aware that the machine has consumed her alive. There is a very specific, haunting quality to the light in Roddy's photographs of Judy. It is always soft, almost melancholic, perfectly capturing the deep, unspoken sorrow resting in her eyes. He photographed her sitting backstage, stripped of the glittering sequins, stripped of the booming, iconic voice, looking impossibly small against the backdrop of massive expectations. In these specific frames, you do not see a difficult, washed-up diva. You see a terrified, exhausted woman silently pleading for a single moment of peace. Roddy intimately understood that the camera is inherently a predatory instrument. It usually takes something vital from the subject. But his unique, unparalleled genius was that his camera did not take, it received. He provided a rare safe harbor for a woman who was actively drowning in the turbulent waters of her own fame. The unsanitized vulnerability he managed to capture was so emotionally profound that it legitimately embarrassed the powerful executives who had built their vast fortunes directly on her suffering. This shocking level of access requires us to critically examine the actual technical brilliance and psychological warfare of his photography. Roddy McDowall was not just a famous guy who happened to own a camera and have famous friends. He was an absolute, dedicated master of the photographic medium. While the rising tide of freelance paparazzi like Ron Galella were aggressively using blinding flash guns and highly confrontational tactics to intentionally provoke an angry reaction, Roddy employed a masterful method of total invisibility. He strongly favored natural, ambient light whenever possible. He expertly shot on fast black and white film that allowed him to work effectively in the dim, moody light of a private living room or a smoky backstage corridor without needing any obtrusive additional equipment. He never asked anyone to pose for him. He never asked anyone to move into better lighting. He simply sat back and observed the room. This was a psychological masterclass in the art of the trusted insider. By flatly refusing to act like a traditional photographer, he forced his elite subjects to entirely forget they were being photographed. He patiently waited for the micro-expressions. He waited for the exact fraction of a second when the performer deeply exhales, their tense shoulders finally drop, and the heavily rehearsed, million-dollar smile fades into a quiet look of genuine introspection. He was operating in an era where the public persona was heavily, expensively constructed. Therefore, capturing a truly genuine emotion was nothing short of an act of rebellion. His sprawling archive became a secret, highly protected ledger of the true emotional cost of stardom. He systematically chronicled the hidden anxiety of an entire generation of cultural icons. And he meticulously categorized them, developing his own rolls of film, making his own contact sheets in absolute private, far away from the prying eyes of studio lab technicians who were notoriously known to steal and leak scandalous photos to the press for a quick payday. The incredible scope of his hidden archive goes far beyond just Taylor and Garland. Roddy was a permanent fixture at the most exclusive, impenetrable enclaves in Southern California, from the locked-down Malibu beach houses to the heavily guarded, gated estates of Beverly Hills. He photographed Paul Newman, stripping away the flawless Golden Boy facade to reveal a deeply introspective, almost brooding man who was entirely uncomfortable with his own massive sex symbol status. He photographed Natalie Wood, bypassing her bubbly, effervescent screen persona to capture a young woman privately wrestling with profound, paralyzing insecurities about her talent. He captured the notoriously difficult Marlon Brando completely unguarded, completely stripped of his usual defensive hostility toward the press. Brando, who famously despised photographers and even physically punched them on multiple occasions, would peacefully sit reading a book while Roddy quietly snapped away from across the room. These were sacred spaces where the general public and the ravenous press were completely locked out. The profound magic of these images is that they totally democratize the icons. When you look at a polished studio portrait, you're looking up at a flawless god. When you look at a Roddy McDowall photograph, you're looking directly at a flawed human being. A human being who probably has a severe headache, who is deeply worried about their next script, who is quietly nursing a broken heart away from the cameras. He captured the thick cigarette smoke catching the late afternoon sun by a private pool, the discarded scripts tossed carelessly on a coffee table, the exhausted slump on a velvet couch after a brutal 14-hour day on set. He captured the deafening, lonely silence of Hollywood. When Roddy McDowall passed away in 1998, he left behind an unparalleled, breathtaking visual diary of the 20th century's most defining faces. His vast collection of photographs essentially proves that the most scandalous, shocking thing you could possibly capture in Hollywood wasn't an illicit affair, a drunken brawl, or a highly public meltdown. The most dangerous thing to capture was sheer, unadulterated humanity. The big studios fought aggressively to keep the pristine illusion alive, but Roddy's lens broke the magic spell permanently. He showed us that the ultimate price of cinematic immortality was an unbearable, crushing isolation. And he did it with the gentle grace of a friend who truly understood the heavy cost. But as we reflect on the stunning secrets hidden for decades in Roddy's Darkroom, it raises a much larger, darker question about the extreme lengths the entertainment industry would go to protect its massive investments. If you want to know exactly how those ruthless studio fixers covered up the absolute darkest crimes of the Golden Age to keep those very same fragile stars out of prison, you need to hear what truly happened in the terrifying shadows of the MGM backlot.